artillery pieces capable of firing 25-pound shells were set up, while over 16 others were kept further back for safer transport across the river during a potential withdrawal. So it's kind of defeatist if you think about it. They're already positioning their artillery to get
Eight
out of there,
eight guns is nothing, especially in World War II standards.
especially
Hell,
when you have
even
16 others. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
uh, even Napoleonic era, even but like a corps would be having 30 cannons. At that time, artillery was not even as prevalent.
Yep. It just goes to show the defeatist mentality that already kind of entrenched itself in the men. And the 25 pounder shells, which were effective against German tanks, in World War II, could have been highly valuable to these frontline troops. It would have made Swiss cheese of any of the Japanese tanks that would have been hit by them, for example. Furthermore, the four battalions' defenses were poorly constructed. They lacked mines, anti-tank guns, despite their availability. Again, they
Just
keep
one
moving
thing I was
things.
just
Yeah.
adding. The British still, at this point of the war, across all theaters, haven't realized that the greatest tank killers are not tanks.
Yeah,
They
it's the
still hold that
anti-tank gun.
belief.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is
And
very
then,
early.
and then
Yeah.
still, but they would have learned it they still did not even learn this in North Africa by now, considering we are in,
Mhm.
Rommel's already given them quite a few bloody noses.
Yeah, that's very true. The battalion behind them possessed anti-tank guns, mines, and barbed wire. So yeah, the frontline guys were basically out there with their hands, in their pants, basically. By this point in the campaign, there was also a huge shortage of boys' anti-tank rifles. It's kind of a staple of the British Army this time. Less than a day before the main assault, he received some information suggesting that there was going to be a major armored attack. A Tamil laborer reported seeing at least 80 tanks in a nearby village. However, his description of the vehicles as having wheels on them led the British officers to dismiss the report, assuming that he was, mistaking trucks for tanks, as tanks have visible rows of sprockets and obviously not the classic wheels of a car. You can picture a tank in your head. That's what they were thinking. They thought the guy he misidentified it. He didn't. These were Japanese Type 95 tanks that had six bogie wheels on either side. Now, exhaustion from constant movement, fighting, aerial attacks, and limited time for defense construction further demoralized the troops, as you can imagine, who were underfed as well, unwashed, and they were sleep deprived. The Japanese, they would initiate probes along the railway line in the morning, but they were repelled by the artillery fire, leaving approximately 60 of them dead. The remainder of the day was relatively quiet. Stuart wanted to withdraw his exhausted men for 48 hours of rest and recuperation. Paris agreed to this, and he sent reinforcements from the Divisional Reserve to a position south of Trolloc Village. 90 minutes after the reinforcements arrived, that's when the Japanese launched their attack. Now, this is a night attack, and it's a night tank attack, which is a little uncommon for World War II, mind you. And this was, of course, under the command of Major Hajime Shimada. I'm not sure. Did you find anything on Hajime? He's only a major, so I would imagine you might not have.
Um, no, I struggled. At the most, I just found just the basic biography of his life, but nothing about his service history, unfortunately.
No, that's what happens. A lot of these battles that we're going to be talking about are lower ranking, like underneath colonel level, and you're not going to find too much information on these guys. But Shimada was commanding the Japanese force, which consisted of approximately 30 T-95 tanks and 10 two-man light tanks, along with trucks carrying the infantry. This is a highly mobile force. Shimada convinced his superiors to allow his tanks to lead the initial night attack. Following some setbacks at Kampar, the commanders likely saw this as at least a worthwhile risk because they did take quite a licking last time. Shimada was aware of the danger of advancing on such a narrow front where artillery could easily devastate his force by about
Oh, the
yeah.
artillery that is very undergunned.
The only thing that the British had an advantage of in the entire campaign was better artillery. And here they are trying to basically get it across the river to run away. Anyways, by 3 a.m. on January the 7th, heavy rain was falling. The defenders were positioned in foxholes along the jungle road north of Trolloc village. At dusk, they heard some gunfire, suggesting the Japanese were trying to pinpoint their positions. At 3:30 a.m., the Japanese began firing their mortars and artillery shells. About 15 minutes later, Japanese infantry were within 300 yards of the forward defenders, attempting to breach barbed wire and other obstacles. At 4 a.m., the tanks arrived, and their machine guns began, firing everywhere, so you'd be seeing like a lot of yellow tracers. Their forward anti-tank guns remained silent, as their crews were possibly dead or they already fled. The tracer rounds caused widespread panic amongst the defenders, who all began to retreat. This caused a rout, which would continue till about 4:30 a.m., when one of Shimada's T-95s detonated an anti-tank mine. The tank behind it was then disabled by a boy's anti-tank rifle. Punjab defenders, positioned on the high ground just near that area, began using Molotov cocktails against the tanks. Which is, another thing that's not talked about too much. This is really prominent in the Eastern Front, and of course, the most common in the Winter Wars between the Finns and the Soviets. The
The
Molotov
boys
cocktail,
anti-tank.
oh, it's the
Oh,
Molotov cocktail. The
true.
Molotov cocktail, as primitive a weapon as you could think, against certain tanks, depending on how their exhausts work, because older tanks in World War II, some of them had these back ports that you could literally just throw an incendiary into. And I mean quite easily. As a human being, you could run behind the tank and do this. And this is how the Finns actually took down a lot of the old Soviet tanks. And over here, I'd imagine they. I don't really know if the Type 95 has this exact. I would imagine it has a default like that too. So they're probably making good use of that. If not, throwing Molotov cocktails, enough of them on a tank will cause it to become quite cooked up. So it's a good way when you don't seem to have enough armor penetration to take these bad boys down. So Shibata's
I
plan is
think
cl Oh yeah, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add just the size, the boys anti-tank rifle. That's a big gun for a man to carry.
Oh yeah, well yeah, it's
So
two guy crews, right?
yeah, so for the audience, the overall length of the entire weapon, 5 feet 2 inches.
Yeah, that's a big weapon.
It's I actually like Googled some photos. You could see it's like the entire backpack of the Finnish soldiers because they it was like the Molotov cocktail used quite heavily during the Russian-Finnish war,
Hmm.
and the skiers of the Finnish army would be having this, and it does pack quite a punch because any weapon any tank that had armor of up to about 24 millimeters, it can penetrate it.
Certainly for the
So it's
Japanese, most of their, I think the heaviest they got here is 22. I think maybe the Type 95 has 422, but yeah, the Japanese armor was very weak for their tanks. Yeah. Shimada's plan clearly backfired, and the Japanese were beginning to panic. His armored column was immobilized, and the defenders' artillery could now target them. Illuminated, of course, by the Molotov cocktail fires that were probably all over their tanks at this point. The Japanese responded by making noise to try and scare the enemy, and the tanks, which lacked radios, very crucial point of information, by the way, forced the commanders to open their hatches to try and shout orders, making them vulnerable to grenades and gunfire. Ironically, the Molotov cocktail fires revealed paths for the tanks to escape, and Shimada's force did manage to break free. The opportunity to
I
destroy
think
the.
the
Oh, yeah.
fact, sorry, one fact that Japanese tanks, like the Italians, and I think most of the French tanks also, radios
Yes.
or lack thereof.
Yeah,
It's
it's
it's quite
it's a
crazy, right? How people do. I think they all underestimate the power of communication between units, because that's literally how Germany won the Battle of France with its tanks. Even though their tanks were outnumbered and outgunned by the Allied tanks.
by like yeah, by a lot too. Yeah, no, the Japanese definitely did not exploit, which was something that they had pioneered, by the way. Radio technology was something in the Russo-Japanese War that they were one of the first to actually try and build their own sets and stuff. So it is kind of sad that they didn't have the forethought to make this a significant issue. Of course, they had the technology, but at this moment, they just weren't using it. The opportunity to destroy the entire column was lost, possibly due to the failure of the newly arrived reinforcements, not having established their telephone lines to direct their artillery fire. So it's a pretty unlucky, really unlucky. The Japanese came right at the time they were shifting their units, and that's pretty much what screwed it up for the Allies. By 6 a.m., most of the Japanese tanks had moved on, mopping up the infantry. However, the leading tanks were halted again by another anti-tank mine. Molotov cocktails were used again, and the 12th Brigade engaged with two anti-tank guns. One tank was destroyed, but the guns soon fell silent, possibly due to gun crews being unnerved by the advancing Japanese infantry. By about 7 a.m., organized resistance collapsed and the defenders began to flee the Trolloc area. Now, in the central sector, defenders witnessed the fleeing soldiers. Captain Kenneth McLeod recalled this, and here it is. It is a quote. Turbaned soldiers ducked around me and under my arms and stood there like a traffic officer to whom no one pays any attention. Interesting quote. It became clear that they were fleeing a tank attack. Roadblocks were hastily set up as commanders attempted to prepare charges to destroy the Trolloc Bridge. The first four tanks appeared, exploiting the remaining darkness. The tanks easily overcame the initial roadblock, but the second line of defense, including armored cars and boys' anti-tank rifles. One tank was set ablaze by a Molotov cocktail and immobilized by a shot from a boy's rifle. The armored cars were hit by tank shells and they were disabled. The defenders heroically tried to push the damaged armored cars to the southern end of the Trolloc Bridge to try and delay the Japanese advance before they would blow it up. The bridge was destroyed around 6:30. However, many Japanese forces bypassed the sector, attempting to encircle the fleeing defenders before they could reach the Slim River position. The Japanese launched ambush attacks with their tanks along the roadways, forcing many defenders to seek refuge in the jungles. Second Lieutenant Ian Primrose was knocked unconscious during one of these ambushes. Upon regaining consciousness, he discovered the Japanese were taking prisoners and segregating the wounded. Primrose said that he and other British walked wounded as they heard gunshots and realized what was happening with mounting horror. He recalled this moment, and this is another quote. Everybody had heard the stories about Japanese atrocities in China, but that was Asians dealing with Asians. We never expected this sort of thing to happen to us. So, for the audience, if you haven't figured it out, the Japanese were basically they were shooting the wounded POWs, so they didn't have to deal with them. And yeah, that's
Well,
the
sometimes we've seen it in so many wars where whether through fear or just brutality or logistical considerations, they kill the POWs or surrendered soldiers.
yeah, because from the Japanese point of view, this is a lightning strike going down Malaya. They are trying to go as quickly as they can to cut off as many men before they reach Singapore. So, yeah, they're not taking prisoners. At least not
And
prisoners that are wounded.
yeah, and you also have to pull back some of your forces to guard them.
Yeah.
And it's also a logistical strain.
Yeah, of course. Afterwards, the surviving prisoners were forced to dig graves for the men that were murdered, and they would carry the wounded Japanese soldiers as they continued. So you can imagine swallowing that pill. Primrose had to carry a Japanese officer he had shot twice. The man died before he could reveal his assailant, however. The column of tanks, trucks, infantry, and prisoners were marching their way towards the Slim
That was
River.
very good for that lieutenant.
Oh, yeah, he would have been killed.